Welcome to the Orbis Cascade Summer Alliance meeting. Wait a minute, Orbis Cascade Alliance Summer meeting, there we go. I'm Margaret Alexander from the University of Oregon. I'll be your host today. We are glad to have you with us for our event. I want to give you a few logistics before we start. You will notice you came in muted. We will keep you muted and ask you to keep yourself muted. If you do become unmuted and aren't speaking, Tamara, our staff host, will mute you. If you have any problems, please send a private Zoom chat to Tamara. If you'd like to speak, use the raise hand icon in Zoom. We'll call on questions in that order. You can go to the menu at the bottom of your screen. The icon to the far right is labeled reactions with a smiley face and a plus sign. You will find the raise hand icon there. Please feel free to post questions or comments in the chat too. We will be posting recordings of today's sessions on the web. You'll get an email when they're available. And the title of this presentation is Cross-Alliance Collaboration in Service of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And our presenters are Crystal Rogers from the University of Washington, Aaron Grant from the University of Washington, Gail O'Hara from the Washington State University, Lauren Goss and Ryan Hildebrand from the University of Oregon, and Stuart Baker, Western Oregon University. The session is scheduled from 11:15 to noon. Let's start. Thanks.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Margaret just said, our presentation is regarding cross-alliance collaboration in service of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Next slide, please. And we want to start our session with the land acknowledgement. The presenters recognize that we are all occupying stolen Indigenous land in the Pacific Northwest region. This slide lists the names of the tribal land we are residing upon for each of our respective cities. This statement is not a stand-in for the reparative work that we must do as non-Indigenous library and archives workers, but acknowledgement is an important first step as we work with our Native American colleagues and community members. We encourage you to search for the tribal land your current location occupies. You can do this at a great online resource, native-land.ca. Next slide, please. My name is Gail O'Hara, and I'm the fiscal year 2020-2021 chair for the Unique Materials in the SILS Standing Group. The SILS stands for Shared Integrated Library System, so basically our shared Primo library catalog. And I'm joined today by the other members of UMSILS, Lauren Goss, Ryan Hildebrand, and Crystal Rogers. Next slide, please. We're also joined today by Aaron Grant, the chair of the Cataloguing Standing Group, and we want to acknowledge all the members of the Cataloguing Standing Group. Next slide, please. And we're also joined by Stuart Baker, the chair of the Primo Customization Standing Group. And again, we'd like to acknowledge all the members of that group. Next slide, please. And we're also acknowledging members of the Archives West Standing Group who assisted with drafting these guidelines. Next slide, please. And last but not least, we all want to give a huge thank you to the Orbis Cascade Alliance program staff for our respective teams and groups, Maya Anderson, Leslie Lowery, and Brian Bowe. Without their guidance and direction, this collaboration would not have been possible. So we are very grateful to all of them. Next slide, please. So just to give you an overview of today's presentation, basically I'm going to talk a little bit about the guidelines and our collaboration. These guidelines regarding equity and bias went up on the Alliance's website in June, and there'll be a link to those guidelines on the last slide of this presentation. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll also discuss recommendations for addressing equity and bias in EAD, MARC, and Primo, as well as digital collections. And you'll see a demo of how to display a general statement regarding equity and bias in Primo. And at the end, we'll have time for questions. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with a snapshot of what these guidelines are. They're titled Guidelines for Addressing Bias in Archival Description and Catalog Records. And basically they provide information regarding the work that is being done already by Alliance and A&M institutions regarding equity and bias. And when I say equity and bias, what I'm talking about is problematic content, but also potentially problematic description from archivists and catalogers. And the recommendation provide 2 tiers of recommendations for addressing equity and bias. And they include options for where to place statements in the library catalog, the archival finding aids, and other descriptive resources. Tier 1 is our recommendations regarding general acknowledgments of bias and problematic content and description, whereas Tier 2 addresses material-specific statements. So essentially, an example would be if you have a collection that has explicitly racist language, Tier 2 would address those kind of materials. The guidelines contain links to examples of statements being used at other institutions, both within and outside the Alliance, so that you have sample language. And the guidelines are also meant to facilitate ongoing discussions around problematic content, description, and cataloging. And please keep in mind that these are guidelines, they're recommendations, they're not requirements, and that institutions should feel free to use and adapt them to suit their local practice. Next slide, please. So basically, UMSILS falls under the Alliance's local, unique and local content team. And the unique and local content team asked their standing groups to center equity in their work during the 2020-2021 fiscal year. And so addressing equity and bias in cataloging and description of historically underrepresented and or marginalized groups is something that UMSILS had previously discussed as a project they'd like to take on. So given the combination of those factors and interest of both the returning and the new members of UMSILS, we formulated our goal, which you see here in that first bullet point, to survey and propose possible solutions to issues of equity and problematic description in our materials. Now, we started out very ambitious, thinking that we could address multiple issues, including provide recommendations for remediation plans. But as we moved through the work, it became very clear that we needed to scale down and focus. The big picture lens through which we were viewing this project soon shifted into thinking about the nuances of the display interfaces, such as the library catalog and Archives West. Next slide, please. So why collaborate? Well, in part because UMSIL's strategic initiative from the Alliance is to increase cross-program work on unique materials and collections in the SILS. Now, and I'm new to the Alliance and doing this kind of work, and just how necessary that is, the cross-program work was somewhat lost on me when we began. However, when we did begin, we initially were thinking about finding aids and displays in Archives West. And so we worked with the Archives West Standing Group to develop and send out a survey of current practices and what kind of guidance institutions would like. And one of the issues that we found is that people would like standardized guidelines around EAD and MARC. And regarding MARC, it was after the new year, so probably around January, February, we were talking about where a general statement might live in MARC. And just around that time, serendipitously, Erin Grant reached out to us, and Erin's the Cataloging Standing Group chair. And so we talked a little, and then in March 2021, a couple of the members of UMSILS were able to attend a Cataloging Standing Group meeting. And I'm not going to go into that too much because we'll be talking about this, my colleagues will be talking about it, but one of the key takeaways of that was that Leslie Lowery, who is the Alliance Program Manager for Technical Services, recommended that we contact Stuart Baker as the chair of the Primo Customization Standing Group. And I can say that that's a group none of us were familiar with, so it would not have occurred to us that that would be a resource. So that's why we were very appreciative of the Alliance staff in guiding us. But overall, the process of developing these guidelines highlighted how necessary it is to reach outside of our own standing groups, as well as our particular Alliance team, in order to make changes or to at least start the process of seeing what kind of changes are possible. These guidelines are a result of multiple standing groups within 3 Alliance teams: the unique and local content team, the technical services team, and the systems team. So it was a lot of people, as you saw on those initial slides, all those members of those groups were instrumental in these guidelines coming together. And with that, next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to Crystal.
Thanks, Gail. So now that you have a bit of an understanding of the context behind the creation of the guidelines, I'm going to talk specifically about our recommendations for how to have statement information display within archival finding aids on Archives West, using both the raw XML encoding and archive space. Like Gail mentioned, UMSILS initial conversations about developing these guidelines for the creation and display of a statement on bias and description began with a focus on archival collections and finding aids. Though unique materials encompasses more than just archives, of course, a large percentage of these materials are archival, and the cataloging of these collections and their display in Primo typically follows the creation of the EAD finding aid, which serves as the authoritative descriptive resource from which the catalog record is generated. To determine the most appropriate field within EAD to link to a general statement on bias and archival description, as well as specific statements on bias and description and/or harmful content within individual collections, UMSILS looked to the Archives West Standing Group for guidance. And after some discussion, it was determined that the processing information field would be the most appropriate tag in EAD for both general and specific statement information. This repeatable field is used to describe interventions archive staff make within a collection, including how we describe materials. It is labeled as the processing note and displayed within the administrative information section of finding aids on Archives West. And you might be aware of the recent update made by the Archives West Standing Group to the finding aid display, where the notes contained within the administrative information section are no longer collapsed. Previously, this information was hidden to users unless they clicked on the collapsed section to view these notes. And this display improvement helped inform our decision to recommend using the processing info field, ensuring that these statements are not automatically hidden from view when a researcher first opens up the finding aid. We also wanted to ensure that these guidelines are applicable to all Alliance members, regardless of the system being used to encode EAD finding aids to upload to Archives West. So the guidelines provide information for how you can link to a general statement, as well as entering information specific to an individual collection in the process info tag within the raw XML, as well as how to input this information using archive space within a multi-part note. Next slide, please. The screenshots on this slide show you how to enter statement information directly into the XML for both Tier 1, linking to a general statement, and Tier 2 for collection-specific statements. The main difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2 of the guidelines for EAD is that a statement link and possibly brief supplementary text, not the full text of the statement itself, should be entered into the processing info note. This is for the same reason that we decided not to recommend that the full text of a statement be included in a catalog record, as this could skew the relevancy of a user's search results. And Aaron and Ryan will talk a little bit more about the MARC record in a moment. However, in Tier 2, we do recommend that the full text of a statement specific to individual collections should be entered directly into this field within the EAD record. Next slide. For those using archive space, this next slide features a screenshot included in the guidelines of how to link to a general statement using a multi-part note. The process for adding a collection-specific statement and a processing note in archive space is essentially the same, but there is an additional screenshot example in Tier 2 of the guidelines for you to reference. And I did post a link to the guidelines in the chat momentarily ago. Next slide. To contextualize the statements and differentiate from other processing information contained within this field, the Archives West Standing Group advised including a header that will display above the statement link or statement text. This slide shows an example of what this looks like in XML, as well as archive space. And we include sample text in the guidelines for the header, but important to note that this is just an example, and the language you use and whether you include a header at all above your statement is up to your individual institution to decide as you apply the guidelines. Next slide. In the guidelines, we also include examples in both tiers for how to encode statement information along with other processing information about a collection into a single processing information note. Alternatively, because the process info tag is repeatable, you can include multiple processing info notes to further delineate the statement information from other processing information about a collection. The screenshots on this slide taken from the guidelines shows examples of how repeating or not repeating might display in Archives West. And as the slide's title states, whether to repeat or not to repeat is up to you. Okay, so now I'm going to hand the mic over to Erin and Ryan to tell us more about UMSILS collaboration with the Cataloging Standing Group and how to handle statements within the catalog record. So next slide, please.
Hi, so my involvement in the Alliance is under the Shared Content and Technical Services, or SETS program, but I also lurk on other Alliance listservs, in particular, discovery and user experience, systems, and unique and local content. Like Gail, I still feel fairly new to the Alliance and to the Pacific Northwest, and I find these listservs very helpful for learning about what other teams and groups in the Alliance are doing. They're particularly useful for me to hear about work that I might not notice otherwise, and that may have an impact on cataloging and metadata work in general, and also on the work of the Cataloging Standing Group in particular. So when I see agenda items of interest on the listservs that I follow, I will also sometimes attend open calls from other program areas outside of SCTS to learn more. Fortunately, everyone has always been incredibly welcoming when I've attended open calls outside of SCTS, so I would definitely encourage folks to attend those outside of your normal Alliance program if you come across items of interest. I know SCTS would certainly welcome guests from other programs in our open calls, so although the trade-off is that you'll occasionally have to hear us listen to us talk about Mark. So in this particular case, I noticed an item of interest on a ULC open call agenda in February about the UMSILS work on guidelines addressing bias and archival description. I attended that ULC open call and noted with excitement that the UMSILS wanted to coordinate with other Alliance groups on this initiative. I let the Cataloging Standing Group know about this work and that I would be reaching out to Gail as chair of UMSILS to see what assistance, if any, they needed from us. Gail wrote back that collaboration between the two groups would be great and that UMSILS was open to guidance and suggestions from the CSG. She also gave me more information about the UMSILS plan specific to adding notes to MARC records. I took this information back to CSG and we started brainstorming some preliminary questions for UMSILS about what they were trying to accomplish and some potential impacts. In our next regular meeting in March, the CSG had a deeper discussion about further questions and concerns that we had with the plan for adding notes to MARC records. From this discussion, the CSG created a Google Doc with a summary of our questions and concerns that we used to frame a joint CSG UMSILS meeting. So members of both groups used that document as an outline and met in late March to discuss our questions and concerns and to brainstorm other possibilities to achieve UMSILS goals. We had a very productive conversation and arrived at some other possible options that would have less undesirable consequences than the initial solution. And to reinforce what Gail said earlier, throughout the collaboration between the two groups, the Alliance program managers were enormously helpful in facilitating communication and joint work. Since the Alliance program managers have deep knowledge of how the Alliance operates as a whole, they truly are a fantastic resource for making connections between groups and teams within the Alliance for collaborative work. And overall, collaborating so widely within the Alliance was a really rewarding experience for me. I got to meet and work with fantastically smart and nice colleagues whom I probably wouldn't have run into otherwise. And it was very gratifying for the Cataloging Standing Group to be able to help another Alliance group achieve a worthwhile goal. Next slide. So why not a globally applied note in MARC 590? So this was the idea that UMSILS initially approached the CSG with, to add a standardized note about bias and description into the 590, which is a local note field in many or all catalog records. The CSG had questions about which and how many records the UMSILS was thinking about applying this note to, if it was only for records for archival collections or also for books and other materials, and if the intent for the note was to be applied to all records as a boilerplate message. We were particularly concerned that if a standard 590 note was added to many or all records in an institution, its overwhelming presence could very well skew patron search results by being repeated in the search index so often. We were also concerned about the amount of technical services work necessary to implement this note on an ongoing basis to newly created records. Who would be responsible for this work, or to set up the normalization rules and import profiles to add this note programmatically? We thought that many, if not most, institutions would not have the time and resources to do this locally on a large scale. The CSG also noted that the 590 field is not set up as a hyperlinked field within Primo, and that any URL added to this field would show up to patrons as text only and not an active link. Configuring this field in Primo to display as an active URL would not be an easy ask of the norm rules standing group. The Alliance is already at maximum capacity in Primo to enable live linking in individual Primo fields. And the request would also come at a very inconvenient time for the NRSG because of Primo VE migration from PBO is planned from October of this year to June of next year. So the NRSG is currently busy preparing for that by rewriting hundreds of existing Primo normalization rules. So based on CSG's collective knowledge of Primo, which is admittedly little because we were catalogers after all, we identified a few other possibilities that other Alliance groups would need to advise on further on implementing besides the global 590 note. Primo banners, like ones that many institutions used for COVID messaging, or Primo page headers or footers that could then link to an institution's online statement about bias and description and harmful content. Using additional 856 fields and catalog records to link to, again, to the online statement for an institution, since this field is already configured to display as an active link in Primo. Creating and importing a libguide about bias and description as a standalone resource for patrons to consult. And finally, using a hyperlinked item level note to an institution's online statement. These item level notes are not indexed in Primo and therefore should not skew search results. So now I'm going to hand it over to Ryan Hildebrand from UMSILS to discuss more about material specific statements and bibliographic records. Next slide.
Thanks. So while Aaron just discussed cases where the 590 in MARC would not be appropriate for blanket statements, there are cases where the 590 is appropriate, and that would be for collection or material specific statements, which I'm going to talk about more right now. So we recommend, as feasible, adding brief statements to individual records representing archival collections or individual resources in any format which contain harmful content. We want to emphasize that we recommend this as feasible, and it is up to individual institutions to determine how comprehensively they would like to implement such a solution. However, we do want to have a clear method for addressing harmful materials when they come to light, whether through a patron complaint, at the point of cataloging, or through serendipitous encounter. And having just heard so much again about the fraught process of changing libraries, LCSH headings, how nice is it to have something that you can implement literally overnight when someone has raised concerns about library material? Hopefully one that is meaningful to our patrons, and one which also can serve to contextualize such materials in our collections. For simplicity of workflow, in all cases, we recommend adding these statements in MARC 590, which is a local note field. MARC 590 is not retained in OCLC World Cat records, and so must be entered in ALMA, where it is added as a local bibliographic extension. See the Alliance's Local Best Practices FAQ and Tables document for more information on how to use this field. Next slide, please. For clarity and prominence, we recommend placing the statement in a single instance of 590, apart from other occurrences of this repeatable field. This is because 590 is often used to capture provenance information, details regarding unique physical characteristics, and other copy-specific information. And it is important that bias and harmful material statements do not get lost in this large chunk of text. We also recommend that you preface each 590 containing a bias or harmful material statement with a standard introductory phrase, such as harmful material statement or bias statement as appropriate. This helps to contextualize the statements within the catalog record and hopefully make them appear more prominently. The use of the standard introductory phrase also makes it easier to identify and potentially manipulate these statements for display purposes in the future. Next slide, please. If a finding aid contains a specific statement, such as described by Crystal, regarding harmful materials or description, that statement should be reproduced in the local bibliographic record, if one exists, that represents the manuscript collection. And of course, statements may also be added to collections primarily or solely represented by a MARC description rather than an online finding aid. Next slide, please. The 590 may also be used in records for single resources in any format. For example, graphics, photographs, sound recordings, manuscripts, and realia, as well as general published material such as books and continuing resources. Statements may be added to local bibliographic records regardless of the physical form of the resource being described. Next. And to Stuart.
Hi, so I am the chair of, or was the chair at the time of the Primo Customization Standing Group. And this is the Alliance's, it's a systems team group responsible for creating and maintaining custom code in Primo. These are things like those banners that were mentioned earlier, just things that extend it in general. So I became aware of this particular project after Aaron and Gail reached out through Brian Vo, who put them in touch with my group to talk about this. We talked about several possible ways to display these bias statements at a meeting, TCSG did, including adding a link in that brief results page after each record, adding collection-specific notices using local fields, working with the normal standings group. And a note there is that we didn't know what the previous discussions had been. So we just sort of brainstormed, threw things at the wall to see what would stick. Other things we talked about were implementing an item policy in Alma and then using a general electronic service to display the bias statement at the collection level, or a customization in Primo using Angular to show a statement for specific items which Primo administrators at each institution could manually enter into their local customization package. And another option we talked about was the fact that you can add HTML into location names in Alma, and that HTML will display in Primo after the location name. But none of these were really satisfactory. Some would require considerable additional work from other Alliance groups. And some, like the HTML thing, are kind of hacky and probably just not a good idea in general. Next slide, please. So the option that UMSILS and the Cataloging Standing Group decided to go with off of our list was to use our existing customization called Primo Custom Actions. This customization lets you add new actions into the send to list in Primo, which appears in the brief and full results for each item returned by a search. And that screenshot there has an example of this implemented. There's that little warning sign and a statement on racist and other harmful content is the text of that link, which goes to the guidelines. Next slide, please. And this slide has a demo video. If you could play that, hopefully it will work. Looks like it's just not there though.
Camera does have it, so it should play momentarily.
Okay, so here's a quick demo of showing that bias statement with Primo Custom Actions.
You can hear it, but can't see it in camera.
So it looks very basic. I'm just going to type in my search term. And then when I click on an item here.
Tamara, I think you may be sharing the wrong screen, perhaps. Still.
Actions item. There's a link right there.
Well, if that doesn't work, oh, there we go. That looks good. Thank you. Okay, so here's a quick demo of showing that bias statement with Primo Custom Actions. This is a sandbox view I set up just for this, so it looks very basic. I'm just going to type in my search term. And then when I click on an item here, I can see my custom actions both under this show actions item. There's a link right there. Or if I click on the full view of this item, there is that up in the send to section right here as well. And you can make that link to anywhere you want it to link. That's about it. Okay, so it's a really quick, basic overview. If you could go to the next slide, please. And here is a bonus method. Another way that you can add this customization or a bias statement into your Primo is under the eShelf menu. That's that little menu button in the top right corner next to where you sign in, where you can see your library card. So I added a link here to PCSG's add custom links to the eShelf menu customization. And with that option, that'll show up there instead of, or in addition to, in the brief and full results tabs. Next slide, please. And that is it for me.
So in our survey and research, we found that institutions predominantly had collection-specific content statements in their digitized collections, but not necessarily statements in their finding aids or MARC records. This is most likely due to the increased discoverability and visibility of these digital items. So now that my fellow presenters have discussed methods for including statements in finding aids and or MARC records, those statements may be repurposed for newly digitized materials in order to provide consistent messaging across separate discovery platforms. So we have 4 recommendations for digital records covering both entire collections and individual items. I'll be sharing some examples from Alliance institutions, but there are several more in our published guidelines. So the first is linking to an existing institutional statement. An institution may choose to include a link on the main digital platform homepage to an existing library or repository statement regarding bias and or problematic content. Alternatively, an institution could include a link to that statement on landing pages for individual collections. The next recommendation is creating a statement for collection landing pages. This could be duplicated from maybe a general statement that's being applied to several finding aids. The example here is from Southern Oregon University on their landing page for the First Nations collection. And this same statement is also repurposed on their Southern Oregon History collection page. So it's an example of how a more targeted statement about unique materials can be reapplied to landing pages for multiple collections. Next slide, please. Our third recommendation is using the description metadata field for standalone digital objects, those without collection landing pages. We recommend using the Dublin Core description metadata field, and an institution may choose to link to a general institutional statement or duplicate a general statement used in finding aids. Our fourth recommendation is probably the most time intensive. It's developing collection specific statements or item specific statements. Again, this could be duplicated from a processing note for a specific finding aid. University of Portland Clark Library has a statement on their yearbook digital collection page. So that's an example of having a statement about specific content found in those specific digitized volumes. And the example here from Whitman College is an example of a specific item level statement. And they've also included an email address. So it's an easy method for patrons to connect with a repository if they have questions or concerns about specific items. So to summarize, the visibility and discoverability of digital collections is a compelling reason to construct and implement some statements about problematic content. Again, depending on staffing, expertise, and technology options at your institution, we've offered 4 different levels of implementation, mapping with those 2 different tiers that we have in our guidelines. Next will be Gail for some concluding thoughts. Next slide, please.
Thank you. So basically, these guidelines would not have been possible at all without the cross-program collaboration within the Alliance. And the depth of that collaboration would not have been possible without the encouragement, guidance, and direction of Alliance staff. It not only helped us, all this collaboration helped us to put the guidelines together, but also, more importantly, our collaboration helped to ensure that the final product was as workable and accurate as possible. The final draft of the guidelines was viewed by the Archives West Standing Group, the Primo Customization Standing Group, the Cataloging Standing Group, as well as the Unique and Local Content team. And UMSILS did make revisions based on the feedback we received. We don't anticipate that this will be a static document. We are open to feedback and from people utilizing them, and expect that they will evolve and be revised over time, which will require ongoing consultation and collaboration between the various Alliance teams and groups. And also, I'd just like to reiterate Erin's point about the benefits of stepping outside of your usual Alliance teamwork and seeing what other teams are working on. Often we have similar concerns and our work can complement each other. And in this case, it helped UMSILS to avoid a potential point of confusion regarding MARC and provided us with a solution for display in Primo. Given all the nuances involved in the SILS and most of our work, it's easy to miss small but vital pieces like that. And then finally, on behalf of UMSILS, I also want to thank all the people that responded to our initial survey in November 2020. There's some really incredible work being done at institutions, and we appreciate you sharing everything that you did. And your responses as well helped to shape our guidelines. And so then you see on this slide, there is a link to the guidelines as well as to the UMSILS webpage. Feedback, please feel free to email me or Maya Anderson at the Alliance. And with that, we are open if there are any questions.
You can put your questions either in the chat or raise your hand.
Well, and I will say, I don't know if everyone saw the question earlier that Erin asked Stuart about the change to Primo VE and if that will work. And presumably it's something that will continue to work. But if you run into difficulties with our recommendations in the guidelines, we do want you to let us know for sure. Because as I said, they are going to continuing to be revised as needed. And certainly as some of these technical aspects change, I have no doubt that they will need to be. So please we do take it seriously. We want you to give us feedback. I won't be chairing UMSILS this coming year, but I'm still on UMSILS, so I can certainly relay any concerns or questions to the group as we go from there.
In lieu of any, oh, there is a question. I see.
Rory asks, for items in archival collections that have been flagged with the statements on harmful content, is the statement added at the discretion of staff, or is there a list of items that should get the statement?
Well, I'll let anybody else jump in as well. I think the point that we're operating from is that it should definitely be done at the discretion of staff. I know for myself in my own work, if we had an opportunity to be able to truly audit our collections, that would be fantastic, but we just don't have the staffing to do that. So as I encounter materials, that's pretty much, or if I know we have lots of collections related to Native American communities, so I might look at those and see what the wording is, what the collection content is to revise. But yeah, it's really depending on what your capacity is. So I am basically doing it as I come across collections and archival description that I find problematic, and I bring it to my team and consult with them, and then kind of go from there. And so we have started to make some of those additions to the finding aids specifically. But I'll let it, if anyone else has.
So to get at Greg's question, have you developed intake processes in the event that users flag something problematic? That is not something that we were able to explore with the creation of these guidelines. And we really wanted them to be, and this is something that Gail said a couple of times, for it to be applicable in a variety of institutional contexts, and people have varied numbers of staff and resources to be able to do that remediation work. But I think we do hope that the guidelines and putting statements about and being transparent about our descriptive interventions into collections, that this will lead to institutions then using that to develop remediation projects. And I'm sure we'd be really excited to hear about those in the future, because I really think we have a lot to learn from each other in that area.
And just to add to that, we do plan at UW on, we're in the process, Kristen and I are involved in this, in creating a statement for UW about this, and then also working on an intake process. And we've had a lot of discussions about the best way to do this, and we're kind of rolling, I think the intent is to roll out a form and then track these requests. But we are, I mean, it's iterative, and we'll try it, and hopefully that will work. And I mean, there's still questions, so it's, I bet it's going to be, you know, adjustments will be needed along the way.
I was just going to say that if you have a form, you can actually direct users to that through Primo, because you can tie, like with that custom action customization, you could add like submit a problematic whatever, and it would actually pull the PNX record or MMS ID, which can help you sort of streamline the process of users saying, I'm having trouble with this specific item. I know we have several institutions, including WU, who do that for just general problems with an item.
Right, and I think that in some of the examples of the general statements, they have specific section that says, if you find something, it explains the process. If you find something problematic, contact us at this location, email. And I know for us, we've just kind of handled it ad hoc as we get something, then we talk about it, but we haven't formalized any process.
It also complicates things somewhat because at UW there's two tracks really. There's the archival description track, which needs to be handled by one department, and then the catalog record track, which is another workflow. So it's, you know, that's one of our challenges, is folding both of those workflows into this feedback mechanism.
I notice we're straight up at 12 o'clock. I'm going to refer everybody, if you have further questions, please do contact the presenters. I'm sure they'd be glad to talk about it more. And our email list, I'm sure, would be also a great forum for discussion. Thank you, presenters. Thank you, attendees. Please take some time to complete our evaluation form. Tamara will put that link in the chat. We will be posting recordings of today's sessions on the web soon. You'll get an email as an attendee when they're available. And if you are signed up for the next session, it will start at 12:15.